I didn't realize it at first, not really. Every night I prepared dinner the way I always had. A warm pot of rice, some steamed fish, a light soup with leafy greens, and perhaps a bit of tofu on the side. It was the same meal my parents raised me on, the kind of food that meant comfort, routine, and stability. My father would sit quietly at the table, his hands folded neatly as he waited for everyone to be seated. My mother would shuffle in behind him, slower than she used to be, but still trying to smile through the stiffness in her knees. We would eat together in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than I remembered from childhood. It wasn't peaceful or content. It was heavy, stretched thin across the table like a film of sadness no one wanted to disturb. I didn't notice how little they ate until one evening, when I found myself clearing nearly full plates. My father had barely touched his rice, and my mother had eaten just a few bites of tofu. When I asked if something was wrong, they both shook their heads. "We're not very hungry," my mother said gently, patting my hand. "Don't worry." But I did worry. I started watching more closely. My father would stare at his food longer than he chewed it. My mother would wince slightly when biting into something firmer. Still, they never complained. I assumed it was just part of aging. Less appetite, smaller portions. That was normal, right? I believed that until the morning my father fell. He was trying to reach a glass of water when his legs gave out beneath him. The sound of his body hitting the floor made my heart freeze. At the hospital, after checking his vitals and running tests, the doctor looked at me seriously and asked, "What has he been eating lately?" I was confused. I told her we always had proper meals, balanced, home-cooked. She nodded, but then said something that shook me. "Your father is showing signs of malnutrition. His muscles are weakening. He doesn't have the energy reserves he needs." This wasn't just a fall, it was a warning. I stared at her, stunned. Malnutrition? That didn't make sense. I cooked every day. I fed them the same food they had always eaten. But that was the problem. I hadn't realized that as their bodies aged, their needs had changed. I went home and began researching obsessively. I learned that aging affects nearly every system involved in eating. Digestion slows down. The stomach produces less acid, making it harder to break down food. Taste buds dull, making meals less appealing. Saliva dries up, which means dry foods become uncomfortable to chew and swallow. Dental health declines. My mother had lost several teeth, which she had quietly endured without telling anyone, choosing instead to avoid meat or anything crunchy. Appetite-regulating hormones weaken, so the hunger signal never rings as loudly. And yet, the nutritional needs don't go down, they go up. Seniors require more protein to maintain muscle, more calcium and vitamin D to prevent bone loss, more fiber for healthy digestion, and better fats for heart and brain function. And most importantly, they need food that is soft, easy to chew, easy to digest, and emotionally comforting. What I had been serving, white rice, bony fish, fibrous vegetables, had become inappropriate. Not because the food was unhealthy, but because their aging bodies couldn't handle it anymore. I had been feeding them with my memories, not with mindfulness. I thought back to the subtle signs I'd ignored. My mother's quiet winces, my father's refusal to finish meals, their growing fatigue after eating. I'd mistaken it for normal aging, but it was actually an invisible hunger. Nutritional deficiencies slowly wearing down their energy, their strength, their dignity. When I finally sat across from them and truly looked, I saw how much weight they had lost. I saw the hollows beneath their eyes, the stiffness in their movements, the quiet caution in every step. I saw the fear in my mother's face each time she had to descend the stairs, and the way my father hesitated before standing, as if unsure whether his legs would support him. And I realized, with a heavy kind of guilt, that I had let them drift into this state because I had failed to notice what they truly needed. I thought tradition was enough, but tradition didn't account for age, so I changed everything. I stopped serving what I thought was comforting and started asking what they could truly enjoy and tolerate. I switched from white rice to soft brown rice porridge. I used ground meats instead of whole cuts. I steamed vegetables until they were soft and tender. I stopped using too much salt and experimented with natural herbs. I offered snacks with purpose, mashed avocado, soft-boiled eggs, unsweetened soy milk enriched with calcium. I blended soups that were rich in nutrients, but easy on the teeth and stomach. I added small portions of nuts ground into paste. I paid attention to protein, to hydration, to fiber. I planned meals that were smaller but denser in nutrition. And most of all, I sat with them. I didn't let them eat in silence anymore. I told stories. I asked questions. I noticed when they stopped chewing. I noticed when they looked tired. I learned to read the pauses between bites. It wasn't just about food, it was about presence, about care. The change didn't happen overnight, but slowly I saw it. My father began to move more easily. My mother stopped holding her stomach after meals. Their faces looked a little less sunken. They began finishing their bowls. And once, after dinner, my father stood up and stretched and said, "That was good." That small sentence felt like a victory. Because when food nourishes, not just the body but the spirit, everything changes. Elderly people are often invisible in their needs. They won't ask for special meals. They won't say, "This hurts to chew," or "I feel weak." They'll say nothing at all. But their bodies speak anyway, through fatigue, through tremors, through that slow, creeping frailty that we pretend is just old age. But age is not the enemy. Neglect is. And neglect doesn't always look like abandonment. Sometimes it looks like a full plate of food that's just not right anymore. Sometimes it looks like giving them exactly what they used to love, without realizing their stomachs no longer digest like they used to, their jaws no longer bite the same, their intestines no longer absorb with ease. And sometimes it looks like love, misguided love, because love without adaptation can hurt more than help. I don't blame myself anymore. I didn't know. But now that I do, I cannot unsee it. I cannot go back to the way things were. My parents need meals that respect who they are now, not who they used to be. They need food that lets them feel full, not stuffed, but satisfied. Not burdened, but nourished. They need food that understands how aging changes everything. Not just the body, but the relationship with eating itself. And I believe every elderly person deserves that. Not just because they are old, but because they are human. And food is a human need, not just for survival, but for dignity, for comfort, for connection. If you have aging parents or grandparents or loved ones, look at their plate tonight. Really look. Not just at what's on it, but how they eat it. How slowly, how silently, how little. That silence might be saying more than words ever could. And you don't need to be a doctor or a dietitian to help. You just need to care enough to change. I did. And it saved my father's strength. It brought back my mother's smile. It turned dinner into something sacred again. A golden meal, made not of expensive ingredients, but of intention. Because when you love someone who is growing old, the most powerful thing you can do is listen to what they're no longer saying, and cook for the body they have now, not the one they had before. It wasn't until I started cooking with intention that I realized food is not just about feeding. It's about respecting the body that receives it. After my father's fall, after watching my mother push her dinner around the plate without finishing it, after reading pages and pages of medical advice and nutrition guides written in cold, clinical language, I sat down with a blank notebook and asked myself the most important question of all. If I truly loved them, how should I feed them now? Not out of habit, not out of tradition, not out of what I thought was healthy enough, but out of care, precision, and deep listening to the new rhythms of their aging bodies. What emerged were not complicated recipes or miracle foods. What emerged were principles, simple, human, fundamental. The first principle was this: low salt. For decades, my parents had seasoned their food heavily, not because they liked salt, but because they could taste it. As they got older, their taste buds dulled, and like many elders, they began craving stronger flavors to compensate. But salt had become an invisible enemy, especially for my father, who was borderline hypertensive. I learned that excessive sodium increased his risk of heart failure, kidney stress, and even confusion. So I started seasoning with purpose, not removing flavor, but replacing it. I discovered ginger, turmeric, fresh herbs like basil and cilantro, and citrus zest. A little lime juice went further than any spoonful of soy sauce. The food was still vibrant, but now it loved them back. The second principle followed closely: low sugar. My mother never liked sweets, but sweetened drinks, they had become her comfort. A bottle of fruit tea here, a sweet cup of condensed milk coffee there. I hadn't realized that even small, habitual doses of sugar could wreak havoc on aging metabolism. Her energy crashed midday. Her digestion slowed. Her sleep was often restless. I didn't need to restrict her joy. I just needed to redirect it. We moved to natural sugars: banana slices in warm oats, blended mango and yogurt smoothies with no added sweeteners, cinnamon and dates for flavoring porridge. She still smiled after each bite, but now her body smiled back. The third rule was born from watching them chew: easy to digest. Food that sits heavily in a young stomach becomes an obstacle course in an older one. Fatty cuts, fried dishes, spicy sauces, they didn't just cause discomfort. They discouraged eating altogether. My parents were already eating less. I couldn't afford for their meals to be unpleasant, so I softened everything. I chose methods that respected their digestion: steaming, boiling, poaching. I reduced oil. I replaced tough meats with minced or ground protein, simmered gently until it yielded to a spoon. I introduced smaller, more frequent meals to avoid overwhelming their systems. I thought back to how they fed me when I was a child, how they'd mash food into small bites, how they'd test the temperature with their lips before letting me eat. And now I return the gesture, not as a burden but as a circle completed. The fourth principle was something I hadn't thought much about before: fiber. Not just any fiber, but the right kind in the right amount. My father had been constipated for months, but never talked about it. He simply moved slower, avoided long trips, and grew quieter. I didn't connect the dots, but once I learned about the slowing of the gut in old age, everything clicked. I started adding chia seeds to their yogurt. I served soft stewed vegetables like pumpkin and okra. I introduced mashed beans, peeled apples, and porridge with ground flaxseed. Fiber became not just about digestion, but about dignity, about helping them feel light, not burdened from within. And finally, the fifth rule, perhaps the most sacred of them all: enough protein. I used to think my parents didn't need much food. They were smaller, less active. But inactivity wasn't the cause, it was the result. The more muscle they lost, the less strength they had to walk, to get up from chairs, to climb stairs. My father's legs had weakened from protein deficiency, not age alone. And yet meat was often too hard to chew, too dry, too dense. So I adapted. I used soft scrambled eggs, silken tofu, slow-cooked lentils, mashed peas, and gently flaked fish. I learned to combine plant and animal proteins to balance texture with nutrition. I wasn't feeding just to prevent hunger. I was feeding to rebuild strength, to restore confidence, to give them back a part of their independence. But beyond these 5 principles, low salt, low sugar, easy digestion, high fiber, adequate protein, was something deeper. It was the 6th invisible rule: kindness. I never announced the changes. I didn't say, "This is your new elder-friendly diet." That would have made them feel fragile, broken. Instead, I said things like, "Try this, it's softer." Or, "I made this soup just how you like it." And they accepted it gratefully, unknowingly. I made sure the food looked beautiful. I garnished with herbs, plated carefully. I lit candles at dinner, just like they used to for me on birthdays. Because when food is served with dignity, it doesn't feel like medicine, it feels like love. I also learned something else, something I never expected. Timing matters. It wasn't just what they ate, but when. I used to give my father a glass of water before bed, thinking it would keep him hydrated. But he started waking up 3 times a night to urinate. It disrupted his sleep and left him exhausted the next day. So I changed. We hydrated steadily during the day: small cups of warm water, diluted juices, soups rich in fluids. And after 7 p.m., I kept it light. My mother, too, began sleeping more deeply when her dinners were earlier, her stomach not too full, her mind not racing from caffeine or sugar. Food became not just about energy, but about rhythm. And rhythm is everything when bodies grow older. With these principles, I didn't just change their meals, I changed their lives. My father started walking again, just a little at first, from the garden to the gate. My mother began humming while eating, a small song under her breath. Their color returned. Their eyes were clearer. Their energy softened, but it didn't vanish, it stabilized. It became reliable. Their meals became quiet rituals of healing. Not dramatic, not Instagram-worthy, but sacred, consistent, grounded in love. And now, every time I plan their meals, I whisper these 5 rules in my mind. Low salt, low sugar, easy digestion, gentle fiber, strong protein. Served with care, served on time, and above all, served with love, because growing old should not mean growing invisible. And feeding someone who raised you is not a duty, it is a privilege. One measured not in recipes, but in respect. I used to think feeding my elderly parents was just about making sure they ate 3 meals a day. As long as they weren't skipping meals, I thought I was doing enough. But after my father's fall and my mother's quiet fatigue, I realized that timing, content, and composition mattered just as much, if not more, than frequency. It wasn't just about having breakfast or getting enough calories. It was about what each meal meant to their aging bodies, what it offered, how it landed in their system, how it carried them gently through the hours ahead. So I sat down one evening with a pen and a quiet heart, and I asked myself, if I could plan one ideal day of eating, not just to feed, but to support, heal, and honor them, what would it look like? I began with breakfast, the meal that sets the tone. I remembered how my father used to skip breakfast, saying he wasn't hungry in the mornings. But later, he would complain of dizziness or weakness before lunch. My mother, too, would wake up sluggish, sometimes anxious, her stomach churning from too long a night without food. So I started preparing a bowl of warm oatmeal, not the instant kind, but slowly simmered rolled oats, soft and creamy. I'd stir in a touch of ground flaxseed for fiber, calcium-rich almond milk, and sometimes a sprinkle of cinnamon. Alongside it, I served a soft-boiled egg, its yolk golden and gentle, offering protein and brain-supporting choline. And then, a simple banana easy to digest, rich in potassium, soothing to the stomach, sweet without sugar. This trio, oats, egg, banana, became our morning ritual. It gave them steady energy, softened their mood, and kept their digestion moving. Most importantly, it felt light yet satisfying, like a promise that the day would be kind to them. By lunchtime, their bodies were awake, and it was time to nourish deeper. I wanted to offer something grounding but not heavy, something that honored tradition but adapted to their needs. So I steamed a fillet of white fish, basa, tilapia, sometimes salmon, delicately seasoned with ginger and scallions. No bones to worry about, no hard edges, just soft, flaky flesh that melted with each bite. Beside it, I served a bowl of canrawang gat, sweet leaf soup, rich in iron and folate, gently simmered with minced lean pork or shrimp for added flavor. The soup was light but warming, like a breath of fresh air in their veins. As a base, I gave them brown rice, but not the hard, chewy kind. I learned to cook it longer, soaking it overnight to soften the grains, blending the familiar taste of rice with the extra fiber and nutrients of its unpolished form. This lunch gave them strength without sleepiness. It rebuilt what the morning had used up, and they ate it slowly, gratefully, often finishing the bowl with a little smile. But seniors don't run on 3 meals a day. Their metabolisms, slower now, preferred gentle nudges of energy. So in the afternoon, around 3 or 4 p.m., when they began to yawn or feel lightheaded, I offered a small, nourishing snack. Nothing processed, nothing fried. Just a glass of warm soy milk, homemade if possible, or from a trusted low-sugar brand, blended sometimes with black sesame for extra calcium and a nutty richness. And next to it, a few walnuts, softened slightly if needed, or ground into a paste and mixed into yogurt. Walnuts, rich in omega-3s, supported their memory, their mood, their heart. The combination of the milk and nuts was more than food. It was reassurance, a cushion for the long stretch between lunch and dinner, a quiet signal to the body that it was safe, supported, and seen. Then came dinner, which I learned had to be soft, calming, and digestible, not because they couldn't handle more, but because heavy dinners stole their sleep. After many nights of tossing and turning, of midnight bathroom trips, I finally found a formula that worked. Mung bean porridge, gentle, protein-rich, naturally sweet, and cooling to the system, became a favorite. I cooked it with a bit of crushed ginger for warmth and served it warm, not hot. Beside it, a plate of steamed vegetables, typically spinach, zucchini, or carrots, lightly salted and drizzled with a drop of sesame oil. The colors were soft, the textures forgiving, the portion modest, but the effect immediate. My father slept deeper. My mother's belly stopped grumbling. There were fewer nighttime awakenings. Their mornings became brighter. This ideal day: oatmeal, egg, banana, steamed fish, soup, soft brown rice, soy milk, and walnuts. Mung bean porridge and vegetables was not built from a cookbook. It was born of observation, of love, of failure and adjustment. I didn't create it overnight. I failed many times. I served the wrong things. I forgot the soft foods. I gave too much at dinner, but each mistake taught me something. And now our kitchen runs on rhythm, not just rules. Meals are no longer about what I want to give, they're about what they need to receive. And that's the difference between feeding and caring. Because when food meets the body where it is, gently, patiently, it becomes more than nourishment. It becomes a bridge, a hug, a way of saying without words, I see you. I understand what your body has lost. And I'm here, not to fix it, but to walk beside it, meal by meal, moment by moment, with respect. One bowl at a time. I used to think a pinch of salt couldn't possibly hurt, that a little extra seasoning was harmless, especially for my father, who had always sprinkled a bit of soy sauce on everything. It was how he ate growing up, how his taste buds were wired. My mother, too, liked her soup a little savory, her fish a little salty, her pickles always just a touch too sharp. I didn't question it. Why would I? They had eaten this way for over 60 years. But everything changed the day my father's blood pressure read 170/95. I still remember the doctor's expression, calm but serious, as he explained what those numbers meant. Hypertension, a silent threat. It wasn't causing pain, but it was quietly damaging his heart, his kidneys, his brain. It was making his legs feel heavier, his head light, his memory foggier. And the biggest culprit, salt. Not just the visible salt from the shaker, but the hidden salt in soy sauce, pickled vegetables, store-bought broths, and even some healthy snacks. I felt ashamed. I had cooked those meals. I had made those choices. I thought I was doing my best, but my best needed to change. I went home and opened every bottle in the pantry. Soy sauce, fish sauce, bouillon cubes, preserved radish, canned soup. I checked the sodium content and felt my stomach twist. No wonder. They weren't just eating too much salt, they were marinating in it. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and made a quiet vow. I would learn to cook without relying on salt. Not tasteless food, not bland food, but food that respected their blood pressure and their dignity. The next morning, I began my experiment. The first dish I tried was Can Rao C1E7N, water celery soup. It was something my father loved as a child, but I had never paid much attention to it. I used fresh Rao C1E7N, washed thoroughly, then simmered it with a few slices of ginger and a piece of lean pork bone, pre-boiled to reduce impurities. Instead of adding salt, I added a drop of fish sauce at the very end, literally 1 teaspoon in a pot for 3 people. I let it simmer slowly, allowing the natural sweetness of the vegetable and the pork to come through. To my surprise, the flavor was light but comforting. My father took a sip, looked up, and nodded. "This tastes clean," he said. That word clean stayed with me. It wasn't just a taste. It was a feeling, a body not burdened, a heart not stressed. I began building other meals around that idea. At breakfast, instead of salty eggs or bread with jam, I offered a ripe banana, simple, soft, naturally sweet, and rich in potassium, which helps balance sodium in the body. My mother smiled at its simplicity. "I used to eat this when I was a girl," she said, and just like that, breakfast became nostalgia instead of habit. For lunch, I wanted to give them something with protein, something that felt hearty but didn't raise their pressure. I bought fresh mackerel, not the canned kind soaked in salt and oil, but a whole fish, cleaned and butterflied. I marinated it with turmeric, garlic, and a touch of lime juice, then grilled it slowly in a pan without oil, just until the skin crisped slightly and the inside flaked perfectly. No salt, no soy sauce, just the aroma of spices and fire. When I served it with steamed rice and sautéed chayote, my mother said, "I didn't think fish could taste this good without seasoning." And I smiled because neither did I until now. In the afternoons, I prepared steamed sweet potato, a variety with purple skin and golden flesh, soft and naturally rich. It gave them energy, fiber, and gentle sweetness without triggering spikes in blood pressure. They ate it slowly, enjoyed its warmth. It was comforting, filling, and required nothing extra. No butter, no sugar. Just the earth's own gift, steamed and served with care. I also began experimenting with flavor layering. If I couldn't use salt, I had to learn how to build flavor from the ground up. I roasted garlic and mashed it into rice. I used onion, slow-cooked until golden. I added lemon zest, fresh herbs like basil, cilantro, dill. I used vinegars, apple cider rice vinegar, in small amounts to bring brightness. A sprinkle of sesame seeds. A dash of toasted peanuts. A spoon of homemade mushroom broth. Every choice became intentional. Every ingredient mattered. Over time, their taste buds adjusted. My father stopped reaching for the soy sauce. My mother no longer asked for pickled vegetables. Their palates became sensitive again, more able to detect subtle flavors, more appreciative of natural textures. But the real reward came not from their smiles, but from their blood pressure readings. Within 2 weeks, my father dropped to 145/88, then 138, then 130. Slowly, gently, the numbers began to reflect what their bodies had been craving all along: balance. Not starvation, not extreme diets, just respect. A commitment to feeding them as they were now, not as they used to be. I realized then that lowering blood pressure wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about taking away taste or joy. It was about giving back control, giving their hearts a little more space to beat without struggle, giving their veins a little less tension to carry, giving their nights a little more rest. It was about reclaiming peace, plate by plate. I wish someone had told me sooner that food can be medicine without feeling like medicine. That you don't need to drown dishes in sauce to make them satisfying. That soft fish, gentle soup, sweet root vegetables, and sun-ripened fruit can speak louder than MSG ever could. That cooking for aging parents is not just about flavor, it's about intention. Today, when I set the table, I no longer fear the silence. I see my parents eat slowly, with ease, with presence. I watch their hands move without tremble. I see them nap after lunch without discomfort. I watch them walk a little farther each day. And I know these changes began not in the pharmacy, not in the clinic, but in my kitchen, with one less pinch of salt, with one more pinch of love. It started with a name. One evening, as we were setting the table, my father paused, staring at the salt jar in his hand. "What's this called again?" he asked. I smiled gently. "Salt, Dad." He laughed, embarrassed. Of course, I don't know why it slipped my mind. We brushed it off, but then it happened again, and again, not just words, but moments. He would forget whether he'd eaten lunch, misplace the television remote, repeat the same story he'd told 20 minutes earlier. My mother began calling him softly when he wandered into the kitchen and forgot why he'd come. Sometimes, she'd say, "Old age is playing games with us," and they'd both chuckle, but beneath the laughter was something quiet and fearful. That's when I realized that memory is not something we lose all at once. It erodes like shoreline, wave by wave, word by word. And as it did, I couldn't help but ask myself, can food help hold the tide? I dove into research, not just blogs or magazines, but clinical studies, elderly nutrition journals, neuroscientific findings. And what I found was both hopeful and heartbreaking. No, food cannot reverse memory loss, but yes, it can slow the decline, nourish the brain, protect neurons, and support cognition, especially when offered early and consistently. The most powerful nutrients: omega-3 fatty acids, particularly DHA and EPA, found in fatty fish like salmon, along with vitamin B12, choline, and antioxidants in foods like eggs, spinach, and chia seeds. These were not exotic ingredients. They were familiar, reachable. But I had to learn how to use them purposefully, rhythmically, and in a way that fit gently into my parents' lives. I started with breakfast. Instead of bread or porridge alone, I made a soft scramble with 1 whole egg and an extra yolk, whisked gently, cooked slowly in olive oil with chopped spinach folded in. I added a teaspoon of ground chia seeds, stirred into warm soy milk or blended into a banana smoothie. The meal was light but rich in nutrients: choline for neurotransmitters, iron and folate from spinach, omega-3s from chia, and the natural sweetness of fruit to start the day with calm energy. My mother liked the color, my father liked the texture, and I liked knowing that this small meal was quietly feeding not just their bodies, but their brains. For lunch, I planned intentionally. I bought fresh salmon, filleted and deboned, and marinated it with turmeric, lemon, and garlic. I pan-seared it gently or steamed it with dill, then served it with brown rice and steamed broccoli. To keep it soft, I sometimes flaked the salmon and mixed it into congee with a drizzle of sesame oil. On other days, I made salmon cakes, mixed with mashed sweet potato and egg, baked until golden, easy to chew and full of brain-supporting fats. Alongside the protein, I always added greens: bok choy, kale, spinach, steamed or lightly sautéed. The brain is 60% fat by weight, and these omega-rich meals gave it what it craved: anti-inflammatory nutrients to protect neurons and strengthen memory function. I didn't expect magic, but I noticed subtle changes. My father had more energy in the afternoon. My mother stopped asking me the same question twice in a row. They weren't sharper overnight, but they were steadier. In the afternoon, I offered a cup of warm oat milk with a spoon of chia or walnut paste, rich in plant-based omega-3s. If they felt like chewing, I gave them a boiled egg, sliced and sprinkled with paprika and a pinch of turmeric for anti-inflammatory benefit. These weren't big snacks, but small, focused doses of care. At dinner, I kept it light. Green vegetable soup, made from spinach and pumpkin blended smooth. Silken tofu with sesame oil, served soft, easy to digest. And sometimes steamed egg custard with chopped greens and minced mushrooms. I avoided heavy starches or high-fat meats. The goal was calm digestion, a steady mind, and peaceful sleep. I learned that vitamin B12 absorption declines with age, especially in those with reduced stomach acid, so I began offering B12 fortified nutritional yeast, mixed into soups or sprinkled onto warm rice. It had a nutty flavor my father grew to love. And most of all, I saw that food wasn't about cures. It was about consistency, predictability, rhythm. Just like the brain prefers routine, so does the body. And so I built a cycle, rotating these core ingredients over days, not repeating exactly, but flowing naturally from one nutrient to the next. In time, eating itself became a memory anchor. A meal meant more than taste, it became a trigger for familiarity. And that, too, supports memory. Because when the world starts to blur, routine brings clarity. I wish someone had told me sooner that salmon could be medicine, that a boiled egg could be protection, that steamed spinach wasn't just healthy, but a gentle hug to aging neurons. That food, when offered with precision and love, is a quiet kind of hope. Today, when I watch my father eat a piece of soft grilled fish, his hand no longer trembling, I don't just see a meal, I see a message. I will not let you fade quietly. I will fight for your memory in every bite. And as long as we sit together at this table, you are still here, with me, with your stories, with your light. Even if the names slip, even if the days blur, we will keep feeding what's left, lovingly, carefully, meal by mindful meal. But healing the body is never a straight line. Some days, my mother would wake up full of energy, humming as she folded blankets and watered the balcony plants. Other days, she would sit on the edge of her bed for long stretches, staring at her swollen ankles or wincing at the ache in her back. "It's the bones again," she would say softly, as if apologizing for aging. But I never saw her as weak. I saw her as someone who had carried so much, for so long, who now simply needed someone to carry her in return. So I kept going, bowl by bowl, building strength not just in her limbs, but in her spirit. I began tracking patterns: the weather, her mood, how much water she drank, how deeply she slept. I noticed that when she didn't eat well, her bones ached more. When she skipped her mid-morning snack, her hands trembled more. The connection was so clear it felt like music. the kind only a caregiver hears when they're paying attention. I adjusted everything accordingly. I moved calcium-rich meals to earlier hours when digestion was strongest. I combined foods that helped each other: calcium with vitamin D, protein with magnesium, fermented foods for better absorption. I wasn't just cooking anymore, I was composing. Each dish was a line of defense, each meal a small poem to her resilience. I started writing them down, these small victories. Monday, sesame porridge, sunlight on the balcony, less joint pain. Wednesday, salmon flakes in congee, longer afternoon walk. Friday, almond tofu pudding, deeper sleep. They looked like notes in a doctor's journal. But to me, they were love letters, sent not through words, but through care. This wasn't caregiving out of obligation. This was devotion, shaped through rhythm and repetition. There is a quiet magic in feeding someone who once fed you. There is no thank you that matches that. Only the return of hands made strong again. I taught myself how to modify traditional dishes she loved. The bon-it I once found too complicated, I now made with finely ground sesame and mashed mung bean, steamed soft until they fell apart on the tongue. The canned C-letter 1EA3 Izan, once too bitter, I now simmered with tofu and pear slices to mellow the taste. I learned that calcium doesn't need to come from dairy, especially when the gut can't tolerate it anymore. It lives in seeds, nuts, small fish, dark greens. It lives in the things our ancestors once ate by instinct. I wasn't inventing anything new. I was returning to wisdom we had forgotten. One afternoon, while preparing soft bone broth from slow-boiled anchovy and bok choy stems, my mother walked into the kitchen quietly and said, "Do you think I'm getting better?" I looked at her. Her hair still silver, her back still slightly bent, but her voice steadier, her grip stronger. "I think," I told her, "your bones are learning to trust food again." She smiled with a kind of peace I hadn't seen in months. Because food isn't just nutrients. It's memory. It's reassurance. It's someone saying with every spoonful, "I am here. You are safe." My father, too, began responding differently. Once indifferent to meals, now he would sniff the kitchen from down the hall. "Tofu again?" he would tease. "But yours tastes better than the store-s." I started packing soft, calcium-rich snacks for their afternoon walks, small jars of black sesame yogurt, chia almond milk, soft bean cakes wrapped in banana leaves. I slipped in crushed anchovy powder into their savory pancakes. I mixed ground walnuts into their rice. There was no fanfare. They didn't even notice the changes, but their bones did. Over time, I realized I wasn't just feeding their skeletons. I was building structure for something deeper: trust, rhythm, vitality. I stopped checking the mirror for signs of aging in them. I started watching how steadily they walked across the room, how long they could stand at the sink without leaning, how rarely they needed the cane. Strength had returned, not the kind that could lift furniture, but the kind that could lift a spoon without pain. The kind that could carry their own bowl to the table with pride. And yet, not every day was perfect. There were setbacks. A cold snap would flare up old arthritis. A poor night's sleep would leave their knees aching. On those days, I'd bring the food to bed. Warm sesame rice pudding with cinnamon, soft scrambled egg with mashed avocado, and a hug served on a tray. I never pushed them to eat. I invited them. I reminded them that meals are not tests to pass, but moments to soften into. And sometimes, that was enough. I also began noticing how their bodies reacted not just to what they ate, but to how they felt while eating. When meals were shared, when they laughed between bites, when we talked about old family stories, the food seemed to do more. They digested better. They ate a little more. They forgot about pain, even for a while. I started lighting a small candle at dinner, putting flowers on the table, playing soft music from their youth. These details didn't cost anything, but they bought back joy. And joy, as it turns out, is a powerful ally for bone health too. One evening, as we sat down to eat pumpkin soup with silken tofu and ground white sesame, my mother reached out and touched my wrist. "I know I'm getting older," she said, "but this makes me feel alive." I squeezed her hand, unable to speak. Because in that moment, I realized something I'd been learning all along. Healing doesn't just happen in the body. It happens in how we're cared for, in how we're seen, in how we're fed, with attention, with softness, with steady, unconditional love. Now, when people ask me what the best supplement is for bone health, I don't say calcium pills or protein powders. I say, learn how to cook sesame into porridge. Steam your tofu with a story. Serve your soup with silence if needed, and a smile if possible. Let food not only enter their bodies, but return them to themselves. Let it feel like kindness, not management. Because brittle bones are not just the result of age, they're the result of disconnection. And strong bones, they are often built in the quiet hours when someone is watching over you, adjusting flavors, preparing softness, turning meals into comfort. This is what I've learned. Bone strength is not just physical. It is emotional, spiritual, relational. It is my father reaching for his tea without trembling. It is my mother carrying her bowl from the kitchen without my help. It is the three of us eating slowly together while the sun dips behind the window and the only sound is the soft clink of spoons in bowls. And that's where healing lives. Not in hospitals, not in pharmacies, but in kitchens. On wooden cutting boards. In soft bowls passed from one generation to another. In soups made with bones, yes, but more importantly, with love. But as the days passed and our new nighttime routine settled in, I began to notice something deeper. It wasn't just that my parents were sleeping better. It was that they were less afraid of the night. For a long time, night had meant discomfort, bloated stomachs, urgent trips to the bathroom, tossing and turning until dawn. But now, with a warm bowl at 6, a gentle drink by 7, and soft lights and music soon after, something inside them began to release. Their shoulders softened. Their sighs became quieter, their steps more grounded. And slowly, the silence of the night became comforting again, no longer a threat, but a resting place. I experimented gently with other variations. On weekends, I replaced the lotus seed porridge with mashed mung bean soup, cooked until silky and topped with a few toasted pumpkin seeds. Mung beans, I learned, helped reduce internal heat and were gentle on the stomach. I made a version with coconut milk and a bit of pandan, which my mother said reminded her of childhood summers. On cooler nights, I simmered millet and red date porridge, which was warm, grounding, and just subtly sweet from the natural sugars in the dates. I found that dates not only gave the dish flavor, but also helped improve blood circulation, which seemed to calm my father's cold hands and feet. It wasn't about inventing fancy meals. It was about learning the language of their aging bodies, listening when they didn't say anything, noticing when they pushed the bowl aside too early or when they stared too long before the first spoonful. Some nights my mother didn't want porridge. She wanted soft, scrambled eggs with steamed spinach. So I made that. On those nights, I noticed she slept even deeper, perhaps because of the protein or maybe because of the familiarity. I began documenting not just what they ate, but how they slept afterward. Lotus seed porridge plus almond milk, 7 hours, only 1 wake. Pumpkin soup plus millet, calm sleep, vivid dreams. Skipped dinner, restless, 3 wake-ups. What emerged was a pattern of trust, not just in food, but in rhythm, in consistency, in being gently carried to sleep, like a leaf floating on still water. And as they slept better, so did I. Because caring for someone, truly caring, is not just about preventing falls or making doctor's appointments. It's about anticipating their quietest needs, knowing when to tuck an extra blanket over their legs, knowing when not to speak, knowing that comfort doesn't always come from medicine, but sometimes from a bowl of soft porridge and the sound of a spoon tapping gently against ceramic. One night, after my mother had finished her sesame milk and gone to bed, I peeked into their room. My father had already turned off his bedside lamp. My mother, still awake, looked up at me. "You've made the night so gentle," she said, and then she closed her eyes. That sentence stayed with me for days. I realized we spend so much time fearing the things that come with aging: memory loss, bone weakness, loss of appetite, poor sleep. But what if we could make aging feel gentle instead of frightening? What if the last chapters of someone's life didn't have to be defined by pain and decline, but by ritual, warmth, and quiet dignity? Food was where I began, but soon it extended into everything. I replaced their hard cotton pillowcases with silk ones that stayed cool through the night. I sewed little pockets of lavender sachets and placed them beneath their pillows. I began brewing chamomile and chrysanthemum tea in the late afternoons, not as sleep aids, but as signals. The day is slowing, your body can begin to soften, you are safe to rest. I also began removing clutter from their room, keeping only soft textures, warm lamps, and books with gentle stories. I found an old speaker and played the sounds of a stream or wind through pine trees. I made sure their blankets didn't weigh them down, but still wrapped them in a cocoon of calm. But the heart of it, the center of the ritual, was always the bowl. Every night, no matter how tired I was, I made that bowl with intention. I stirred it slowly, I tasted it gently. I made sure it wasn't too hot, not too thick, always served warm enough to soothe but never scald. I wiped the edge of the bowl before carrying it out. And I always set it down with both hands, because love should always be offered with two hands. And slowly, they began to receive it like a blessing. My father, once stoic and reserved, began holding the bowl with a kind of reverence. "It's the best part of my day," he told me once, cupping it in his hands like it was medicine. My mother sometimes kissed the spoon before the first bite, a quiet, almost childlike ritual that made my chest ache in the best way. I knew then that I had created something sacred, not because the food was magical, but because the act of making it was. And I also knew this: no pill can ever match what that bowl contains, because inside that bowl is attention, care. A daughter's worry turned into warmth. A family's love stirred slowly over low heat. A night rewritten not with sedation but with trust, with silence, with sleep. And so now, even when life is hard, even when time feels rushed or money is tight or the world outside is chaotic, I protect that moment. The soft evening, the gentle food, the candle on the table, the two bowls steaming side by side. Because in those bowls are all the years they spent taking care of me, tucked now into a small offering I give back to them. Because sleep doesn't begin in the bedroom, it begins in the kitchen. And love, real love, begins with a bowl of calm at exactly the right hour. It's one of the quietest forms of worry, the moment you realize your aging parent isn't eating much anymore. Not because there isn't food, not because they're sick, but simply because they say they're not hungry. At first, I brushed it off. My mother would wave her hand and say, "I'll eat later." My father would take 3 bites and claim he was full. I thought maybe they were snacking, or their activity level was low, or they just didn't feel like eating that day. But then one day I noticed my mother's pants looked too loose. My father's shoulders had grown narrower. Their movements were slower, their energy dimmer. And beneath that gentle refusal to eat was a growing, invisible threat: malnutrition, not because of lack of food, but because of lack of desire. That's when I learned a hard truth. Older adults don't always feel hunger the way they used to. Their metabolism slows down. Their digestive system becomes more sensitive. Their saliva decreases, making swallowing harder. Their sense of smell and taste dulls, so food just isn't exciting anymore. And worst of all, many of them won't complain. They'll smile politely, push the food around, and go back to bed with an empty stomach. I knew I couldn't force my parents to eat more. So instead, I decided to feed them smarter. If they could only eat a little, then that little had to matter a lot. Every bite had to be easy to chew, easy to swallow, and rich in nutrients. No wasted space. No empty calories. I started with texture. Gone were the dry breads, tough meats, and crunchy raw vegetables. I moved toward foods that felt like kindness on a spoon. Soft, smooth, warm. I cooked carp porridge, fresh fish simmered slowly with soaked rice, ginger, and a little green onion. The flesh was flaked carefully, the bones strained, the grains broken down into a creamy, nourishing base. Carp is high in protein and omega-3s, but gentle on the stomach. It filled my father's belly without overwhelming it. For my mother, who needed more calories but could only manage half a bowl, I added toasted sesame oil. Just a few drops, swirled into the porridge for flavor and healthy fat. That small adjustment meant the same amount of food gave her more energy. I then turned to plant-based milks, especially green bean and black sesame soy milk, a quiet powerhouse of nutrition. I blended mung beans, soaked overnight with a spoon of black sesame seeds, and cooked them into a warm, smooth drink. It was creamy without cream, sweet without sugar. The sesame gave calcium and iron. The mung beans offered protein and fiber. My mother sipped it slowly in the morning sun. "This tastes like something from childhood," she whispered. That memory alone brought her back to the table the next day. One of the hardest parts of feeding someone with low appetite is watching them reject food you spent time preparing. It feels personal, even though it is. So I learned not to pressure. I learned to offer smaller bowls, smaller portions more often. Instead of 3 large meals, I gave them 5 tiny meals, each no more than a teacup's worth, but each dense, intentional, loving. For example, I made tofu in tomato sauce, soft, silky tofu cut into cubes, lightly pan-heated, then simmered in a sauce made from fresh tomatoes, garlic, and a pinch of ground sesame. No MSG, no fish sauce. Just depth of flavor from real ingredients. The bright red color made the dish visually appealing. The aroma invited them to try just one bite, and one bite was all it took. The rest followed gently. I also discovered a trick: grinding nuts and seeds into pastes or powders. My father couldn't chew almonds anymore. My mother had stopped eating walnuts. But if I ground walnuts, sesame, and sunflower seeds into fine powder and mixed them into rice porridge or plant milk, they consumed all the goodness without knowing it. Calories, healthy fats, trace minerals, all hidden inside a soft spoonful. When I had more time, I made steamed egg custard with mushroom broth and shredded carrots. When I needed something quick, I stirred mashed pumpkin with coconut milk and a spoon of almond paste. I added flavor with natural umami: dried shiitake soaking water, roasted garlic, a few drops of sesame oil. And most of all, I slowed down. I sat with them. I watched how they chewed. I noticed when they got tired halfway through. I learned their patterns. I adapted not just the food, but the way I offered it. I brought warm cloths to wipe their hands. I served food in pretty bowls. I never asked, "Why aren't you eating?" Instead, I said, "Try this, it's your favorite." And if they only took 3 bites, that was enough. Because those 3 bites were packed with everything they needed: protein, calcium, healthy fat, flavor, memory, love. And over time, I saw something extraordinary. Their strength returned slowly. Their naps became shorter. Their laughter returned at dinner. Their bodies, once dull with fatigue, moved with a bit more energy. They didn't eat more, but they ate better. And that, in the end, was all they needed. Today, when I cook for them, I think not about volume, but value. I ask myself, is this bite soft enough to bring comfort? Is it dense enough to nourish? Does it taste like a memory? Does it honor their age? Because feeding someone who eats very little is not about fighting them. It's about serving their body's truth. And when we do that, even the smallest meal can carry the greatest care. But soup didn't just bring warmth. It brought back rituals we thought we'd forgotten. On Saturday mornings now, I take my time, pulling vegetables from the fridge, soaking mushrooms, peeling carrots slowly by the sink while the sunlight pools in through the kitchen window. My grandmother sometimes watches me from her chair, her eyes soft, following each movement like a quiet ballet. Sometimes she hums old folk songs, half remembered from her youth. Other times she just says one word, "Tham qua," and I know she means everything. The smell, the memory, the feeling of being cared for. That 4th weekend, I tried something new: sweet potato and miso soup. It was inspired by her love of Japanese flavors, though I kept everything soft and simple. I cubed orange sweet potatoes, simmered them with a sliver of kombu seaweed and a dash of white miso. The result was earthy, sweet, and savory all at once. I mashed a few cubes gently with the back of a spoon before serving, so each bite had both texture and melt-in-the-mouth comfort. I added finely chopped green onions right before it hit the bowl. She took one bite and then another, more than I expected, and whispered, "Reminds me of when your grandfather and I traveled to Kyoto. We had soup by a little river." Her eyes shone, misty with nostalgia. That soup didn't just feed her body. It returned a piece of her history. By the 5th weekend, soup became more than food. It was our way of honoring the stories that never made it into photo albums. I made a creamy carrot ginger soup that week. bright orange, with just enough spice to warm the throat but not overwhelm the senses. I simmered chopped carrots with onion, garlic, and grated ginger, then blended them into velvet. I finished it with oat milk for creaminess and a drop of flaxseed oil. My grandfather smiled when he tasted it and said, "This would have been good for our son when he had a cold." He meant my father, who had passed. The soup brought back the memory, not in grief, but in a quiet honoring. Sometimes, soup is a time machine. The 6th weekend, my uncle visited, and I used it as an opportunity to bring everyone together. I made a broccoli almond soup. I steamed broccoli until it turned emerald green, blended it with toasted almonds soaked overnight, and seasoned it with a pinch of salt and pepper. I added soft cubes of steamed potatoes for bulk. I served it in wide ceramic bowls with a swirl of almond milk on top. My uncle, who had never been fond of vegetarian dishes, finished his bowl and then asked for more. He said, "Didn't expect it to be this good, or this filling." That made my grandmother beam. "It's because she cooks with her heart," she said, pointing at me. I blushed. But in truth, it wasn't just heart, it was intention. A desire to make food feel like a hug. By the 7th weekend, we had a rhythm. They would sit down before I even called them. I made tomato barley soup that day because it was rainy and a little cold. I slow-simmered chopped tomatoes, carrots, and celery in a vegetable broth with pearl barley. The grains puffed gently, giving the soup a soft chew that my grandfather said reminded him of rice from wartime rations, only better. I flavored it with a little garlic and basil, served it with a slice of soft whole wheat bread on the side. It wasn't fancy, but it felt whole, honest, grounding, like the kind of food that doesn't try too hard but lingers with you anyway. That Sunday, we didn't talk much during the meal, but there was a comfort in that silence. The sound of spoons against bowls, the soft hum of the kettle in the background, the occasional sigh of satisfaction. My grandmother reached over once, touched my wrist gently, and said, "You give us something more than food, you know." I didn't know how to respond, so I just smiled and kept ladling. The 8th weekend, I felt daring. I made mushroom and barley cream soup, but with cashew cream I had made from soaked cashews and a dash of lemon juice. The mushrooms were sautéed with shallots, chopped fine, and cooked until brown and fragrant. I used both fresh and dried mushrooms for depth. The barley added a satisfying chew. I garnished it with finely chopped parsley and served it in small cups with tiny wooden spoons. My grandfather tapped the spoon against the rim of his cup and joked, "This is what kings eat, I'm sure." But the way he savored each bite told me it wasn't just a joke. He felt regal in that moment, valued. By the 9th weekend, I realized I was no longer cooking for just their nutrition, but for their identity. Soup had become a form of remembrance, of gratitude, of storytelling. That week, I made a coconut lentil soup with yellow split lentils, turmeric, ginger, and coconut milk. It was sunny in color and gentle in taste. I served it with soft roti on the side. My grandmother tore her piece with delicate hands, dipped it into the soup, and closed her eyes before chewing. "This reminds me of the South," she said, a place she had not been in decades, but whose flavors lingered in her soul. That day, I learned, food brings geography back to those whose bodies can no longer travel. On the 10th weekend, I tried something both sweet and savory. Apple fennel soup. I had seen a version of it in a cookbook and adjusted it to be senior-friendly. Less spice, more smoothness. I roasted apples and fennel until golden, blended them with a mild vegetable broth, added a tiny touch of ginger, and served it warm. The aroma was unexpected, fruity, herbal, comforting. I served it with a soft biscuit on the side. They were confused at first, but intrigued. After a few spoonfuls, my grandfather nodded. "I wouldn't have made this, but I'm glad you did." It was his way of saying thank you for pushing boundaries gently. And so, as the weeks passed, our weekends transformed. They became miniature ceremonies of flavor, of connection, of care. The house began to smell like old joy again. The table, though small, felt grand. I even began writing little recipe notes on cards and leaving them on the table in case someone else wanted to try. "This one helps digestion," I'd write, or "for rainy days only." My grandmother collected them in a box she labeled weekend treasures. What surprised me most wasn't their gratitude, it was how I changed. I started waking up earlier on Saturdays, excited to try a new broth, a new garnish, a new bowl. I found joy in slowness, in peeling garlic carefully, in watching butter melt into onion, in tasting with a wooden spoon and adjusting salt by memory. Cooking became less about skill and more about intention. My heart began to soften, just like the soup I stirred. By the 20th weekend, we had built a tradition so strong, it no longer needed words. The soups rotated, old favorites, new experiments, borrowed flavors from neighbors. But what never changed was the care. I always served with 2 hands, always said, "This is for you." Always watched the first bite, hoping for that smile, that pause, that sigh that meant it was enough. And now, when people ask me why I spend so much effort making soup, when there are easier ways, faster options, ready-made meals, I don't talk about nutrients or recipes or even aging. I tell them this. Soup is not just food, it's a memory, a message, a form of love that asks for nothing in return. It says, "You're still worth cooking for." Because they are, every weekend, every spoonful, every breath, they are worth it. I used to think love was measured in the big things. The hospital visits, the expensive medications, the vitamin bottles lined up in perfect rows. I believed that caring for my aging parents meant reminding them to take their pills on time, booking checkups, keeping their blood pressure under control. And yes, those things mattered. But what I've learned, slowly, quietly, through days that felt long and evenings that felt still, is that the deepest love is rarely loud. It doesn't arrive in a rush. It doesn't need a label. It's served gently, one bowl at a time, across the dinner table. You see, for a long time I was obsessed with numbers. Grams of protein, levels of calcium, fiber intake, water goals. I treated every meal like a clinical checklist, thinking if I got the nutrients right, I was doing my duty. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing them, my parents, not as people I loved, but as systems to maintain. Until one rainy evening, I placed a perfectly balanced meal in front of my father, and he stared at it blankly. "It's all good for you," I said with a smile. He picked up his spoon, held it in the air, and quietly replied, "I know, but it doesn't feel like home anymore." That sentence cut deeper than any diagnosis, because he was right. I had forgotten the most essential part of food. It's not just what it contains, it's what it means. For older adults, especially those who have lived a full life of cooking for others, feeding their children, sharing stories over meals, food is memory. It's culture. It's presence. A meal isn't just fuel. It's a moment of connection, a bridge back to belonging. And so I began to change. Not the nutrition, but the intention. I started asking my parents what they missed. My mother said, "I miss the soup my mother used to make." It wasn't fancy, but it always made me feel safe. My father said, "I just want a warm bowl and someone to eat with." That last part stayed with me. Someone to eat with. Because all the supplements in the world cannot replace the feeling of being seen, of having your chair pulled out, of being asked, "Would you like more?" with genuine warmth. I began showing up differently. I made simple meals, but I served them slowly. I placed a napkin on their lap, sat beside them, turned off the TV. I waited until they took the first bite before I touched my own. I asked about their day, even if I already knew how quiet it had been. I listened to the same story twice, because sometimes repetition is memory trying to hold on. I learned to let food carry emotion, not just nutrients. On weekends, I brought color to the table. Orange pumpkin soup in handmade bowls, green spinach eggs with tiny flowers from the garden, sweet potatoes carved into heart shapes. I wasn't decorating, I was showing that they were still worthy of beauty. On quiet days, I offered soft foods, but plated them with elegance. Warm congee with sesame oil, garnished with 2 tiny slices of ginger. A boiled egg sliced neatly, placed on a banana leaf. Toasted tofu cubes stacked like little towers. Why? Because when food is presented with care, it tells the body, you are not a burden, you are cherished. Over time, something shifted. My mother began to hum softly during meals again. My father started finishing his bowl and asking what was for dinner tomorrow. They didn't eat more, but they felt more. Because love wasn't just around the food, it was in the food. In the way it was chosen, cooked, served, shared. I realized that the table had become our healing ground, not just for the body, but for the heart. And here's something else. When seniors feel emotionally nourished, they digest better. Their appetite improves, their sleep deepens. I saw this happen in real time. My parents' eyes brightened. Their shoulders relaxed. Their laughter returned not as loud bursts, but as soft ripples. And I knew then. I could have bought every supplement on the shelf, but none of it would matter if the food was served in silence, in isolation, in routine. Because love doesn't come in capsules, it comes in comfort, in flavor, in presence. These days, I no longer rush mealtime. I treat it like prayer, like poetry. I prepare with intention. I bring my whole self to the table. Sometimes I tell them what the food contains. This one has calcium for your bones. Other times, I don't say a word. I just place the bowl in their hands and watch the warmth reach their fingers before it reaches their stomach. On special days, I make their favorite childhood dishes, not perfectly, but with heart. On difficult days, I bring broth and sit in silence. But I never let them eat alone, not anymore. Because that's where love lives, not in a pharmacy, not in a bottle, not in the occasional grand gesture, but in the daily ritual of showing up with food and with heart. And if I could give advice to anyone caring for elderly parents, it would be this. Don't underestimate the power of a single meal. Don't treat it like an obligation. Treat it like an offering, a golden meal. Not golden because it's expensive or elaborate, but because it's made with devotion. Because it speaks louder than words. Because it says, I remember who you are, I'm here, and I love you. And as long as we eat together, you will never be alone. You will never be forgotten. Because this meal, this simple, warm, carefully served meal, isn't just feeding your body. It's feeding the bond between us. And that is something no pill, no treatment, no technology can ever replace. In the end, a golden meal does not just nourish the body, it nourishes love itself. And that's the kind of medicine we all need most.